Welcome back to International Relations 101. I'm William Spaniel. Today's topic is understanding suicide terrorism. We're going to do this from two perspectives. Why do individuals become suicide terrorists? And why are organizations willing to send out operatives on suicide missions? Let's start with that first question because it's a little bit easier. Why do individuals become suicide terrorists? As we saw in the last lecture, opportunity cost isn't a good explanation for this. Under that conventional wisdom, suicide terrorists are effectively bums. They have nothing going for them in their lives, so they commit suicide attacks. If that were the case, what we would not expect to see are individuals committing suicide attacks who are relatively well off, who have better economic opportunities available to them, and who have higher levels of education than the pool of individuals that might become terrorists. And yet that's exactly what we observe, oftentimes, and who we see committing suicide attacks. So that means opportunity cost doesn't get us very far. There is, however, a second explanation, and one that I think is particularly compelling to explain this. Imagine for the moment there are strategic and tactical advantages to suicide terrorism. I'm going to go into more detail on what those are in a second, but just bear with me for a moment. It stands to reason that a very, very small percentage of people in a large population will have an extreme grievance or be extremely ideologically opposed to a policy that a target is committing. Very small population out there, but it stands to reason there are some people for a particular target of a terrorist attack who just really dislike that target, whether it's because something happened in their lives, perhaps a loved one was killed by that target, or they just really dislike the policy that the target is implementing. It stands to reason that there are people out there like that. They might then be willing to forego the benefits to them in the future, that is, their own lives, to be willing to exploit the tactical advantage that comes with suicide terrorism. So it's this grievance and this ideological preference that's driving this sort of behavior. Okay, that explains why some individuals become suicide terrorists. What's going on with the organizations? Why are they conducting these types of attacks? Let's start with the strategic advantages. There are many frameworks that help us understand why terrorist organizations commit attacks, but a common one, and certainly the one that organizations themselves try to promote, is a policy-oriented focus. That the long-term goal of terrorism is to convince a political opponent that the sustained costs suffered through terrorism are simply not worth the policy in dispute. In this way, terrorist organizations are effectively fighting wars by other means. They know that they would lose in a straight-up battle between two armies, so they resort to irregular tactics, that is, terrorism. If that's the case, the goal for an organization should be to convince the opponent that they are really committed to this, that there will be an attack tomorrow, there will be an attack the next day, there will be an attack the next week, there will be an attack next month, there will be attacks all the way into next year, as long as the target does not forfeit the policy. As we've seen, though, throughout this course, communicating those sorts of preferences is very difficult. An organization that cares a lot about the particular policy has an incentive to bluff as though this policy is the only thing in the world that they care about. And that makes it really difficult for the target of a terrorist attack to know exactly how much resistance they should expect to face in the future. So that in turn means that you could use costly signaling to try to resolve this sort of information problem. And that's one argument for what suicide terrorism is. That suicide terrorism is a strategy used by terrorist organizations to communicate just how committed their people are to the cause. We have recruits, this is what organizations are saying. We have recruits who care so much about this policy that they are willing to kill themselves to try to convince you to let go of it. And if it were the case that we only had moderate interest in trying to secure this policy, we wouldn't have individuals who are so extreme in their ideology or so extreme in their grievance that they would be willing to do this. So if you do not give up, if you continue holding on to that policy, you can expect lots and lots of costs later on because there's going to be more and more terrorism. So you should just give up. There are also tactical advantages to suicide terrorism. To begin, planning an attack is much harder when you also need a plan to escape. I think the September 11th attacks are a really good example of this. Reconceptualize 9/11, except all of the suicide terrorists somehow make it out of there alive. That doesn't even begin to make sense. There's no way you can conduct that sort of operation without it being a suicide mission. Another advantage for terrorist organizations is that suicide bombers are effectively smart bombs without the technology. There are a pair of eyes and ears out there with the weapon to be able to change plans on the fly. Maybe, for example, you were planning on bombing one particular street corner, but then the opposite corner had a lot of people just get off of a bus. The suicide bomber has the ability to make the decision on the fly not to go with the original plan, but to go with something that was a little bit more valuable in terms of how much damage it's going to do. That's not something that you can do if you're going to drop a bomb and then walk a couple of blocks away before you blow it up. One last tactical advantage that suicide terrorism gives organizations is that non-suicide attackers leave evidence behind. Think about the Boston Marathon bombings. The Tsarnaev brothers left evidence behind, and very quickly, the United States government figured out who they were and were able to track them down. This is a really big problem if you're a large network of terrorists. If your organization is very, very large, you have to be really concerned that your operative, if he or she is caught, will be put into jail and may start leaking information, may start giving information to the police about other people in the network, other attacks that are planned, and so forth. And there are some things that you can do with your organizational structure to limit that sort of damage, but nevertheless, it's risky to have those sorts of individuals in police custody. Suicide attacks solve that problem because if the suicide attack is effective, there's no individual left behind. And so it's for those tactical advantages and also the strategic advantages that terrorist organizations are willing to forego all future labor from an operative that they could be receiving if they kept the operative alive by sending in an operative to commit a suicide attack. So this helps us understand suicide terrorism, and in the next few lectures, I'm going to start thinking more broadly about different sorts of strategies that terrorist organizations implement. Hope you enjoyed this, and hope to see you next time. Take care.